You're standing guard at the most prestigious palace in the world, sworn to silence, trained never to speak unless spoken to, and bound by centuries of tradition. Your family has served the crown for generations. Your entire identity revolves around one simple rule: never, ever break the code. But what happens when you witness something so shocking, so earth-shattering, that staying silent becomes impossible? What do you do when the very institution you've pledged your life to protect is built on lies that could destroy millions of innocent people? This is the story of Marcus Chen, a third-generation royal guard who made a decision that sent shockwaves around the globe. In less than 48 hours, his single act of defiance would topple governments, expose decades of corruption, and prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply telling the truth. What you're about to read isn't fiction. It's the real account of how one man's conscience became more powerful than kings, presidents, and the world's most protected secrets. This is the story of the day the palace walls came tumbling down, not from war or revolution, but from three simple words spoken by a guard who decided that some truths are worth losing everything for. The world was never the same again. Marcus Chen never imagined that his entire world would crumble because of what he overheard during a routine night shift. Born into a family where serving the crown was not just a job but a sacred calling, Marcus had been groomed for this life since childhood. His grandfather had stood guard during the Great Wars. His father had protected 3 different monarchs. And now it was his turn to carry on the family legacy. The Chen family lived in a modest house just outside the palace grounds, close enough that Marcus could walk to work each morning, but far enough to maintain the necessary distance between the royal family and their servants. Growing up, Marcus learned that discretion was the highest virtue. At dinner tables, conversations about work were forbidden. His father would return home each evening, hang up his uniform, and transform into a regular man who discussed weather, sports, and neighborhood gossip. Never what happened behind those palace walls. This culture of silence wasn't unique to the Chen family. It was woven into the very fabric of palace life. Every guard, every cook, every cleaner, and every advisor understood that their position came with an invisible contract, written in trust and sealed with absolute loyalty. The palace operated like a small city, housing over 3,000 people, yet somehow managed to keep its secrets locked away from the outside world. Marcus excelled in his training from the very beginning. At 22, he was among the youngest guards ever selected for the elite inner circle, those trusted to patrol the private quarters where the royal family lived their most intimate moments. His supervisors praised his attention to detail, his ability to blend into the background, and most importantly, his unwavering commitment to the code of silence that had governed palace guards for over 4 centuries. The palace itself was a maze of corridors, hidden passages, and rooms that served purposes most people could never imagine. Marcus learned every inch of this labyrinth during his first year of service. He memorized the location of panic rooms, secret exits, and surveillance blind spots. He studied the daily routines of each royal family member, understanding that protecting them meant anticipating their needs before they even realized those needs existed. During his second year, Marcus was assigned to the night shift in the East Wing, considered one of the most prestigious postings for a guard of his experience level. The East Wing housed the private offices where the royal family conducted their most sensitive business. It was here that international negotiations took place behind closed doors, where billion-dollar trade agreements were hammered out over late-night meetings, and where decisions that affected millions of lives were made with the stroke of a pen. Marcus took pride in his invisibility during these moments. He learned to position himself in such a way that he could monitor every entrance and exit while remaining virtually unnoticed by the people he was protecting. Politicians, business leaders, and foreign dignitaries would flow in and out of these meetings, completely unaware that every word they spoke was overheard by the silent figure standing guard in the shadows. The training for this level of discretion was unlike anything most people could imagine. Guards underwent psychological evaluation to ensure they could compartmentalize information. They were taught meditation techniques to help them remain focused during long shifts without becoming mentally engaged with the conversations happening around them. They learned to listen for threats while filtering out content that wasn't relevant to security. But Marcus discovered that the human mind isn't a recording device that can be turned on and off at will. Despite his training, despite his family's legacy of service, despite his genuine desire to honor the traditions that had shaped his entire identity, he found himself absorbing fragments of conversations that painted a picture far different from the public image of the royal family. At first, these fragments seemed harmless enough. He overheard discussions about media strategy, about managing public perception during difficult times, about the careful choreography required to maintain the monarchy's popularity in an increasingly democratic world. These conversations made sense to Marcus. Of course, the royal family needed to be strategic about their public image. Every public figure, from movie stars to politicians, engaged in this kind of reputation management. However, as months passed, the conversations began to take on a darker tone. Marcus started hearing references to payments that didn't appear in any public budget, to agreements with foreign governments that contradicted official diplomatic positions, and to a network of offshore accounts that seemed designed to hide rather than manage royal finances. The turning point came during a particularly cold February night when Marcus was stationed outside the private conference room where the king often met with his closest advisors. The heating system in this section of the palace had been malfunctioning for weeks, creating an unusual acoustic situation where voices from inside the conference room could be heard more clearly than usual in the adjoining corridor. On this night, Marcus found himself listening to a conversation that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The king was meeting with representatives from 3 different multinational corporations, discussing what they called the African situation. As Marcus gradually realized, they were talking about a series of mining operations that had displaced over 200,000 people from their ancestral lands. The displacement itself wasn't the shocking part. Marcus understood that economic development sometimes required difficult decisions. What stunned him was hearing the king discuss the systematic murder of community leaders who had opposed the mining operations. These weren't deaths that occurred as unfortunate side effects of political instability. They were planned executions, carried out by mercenary groups that were being funded directly from royal accounts. Marcus felt his hands begin to shake as he absorbed the implications of what he was hearing. The king wasn't just aware of these murders. He was actively participating in their planning. The conversation included detailed discussions about which local leaders posed the greatest threat to the mining operations, how much it would cost to eliminate them, and what kind of political cover story would be most effective in explaining their disappearances to international observers. As the meeting continued, Marcus learned that this wasn't an isolated incident. The royal family had been involved in similar operations across 4 different continents, always working through intermediaries and shell companies to maintain plausible deniability. The profits from these operations weren't being used to benefit the people of Marcus's country. They were being funneled into personal accounts that allowed the royal family to maintain their lavish lifestyle while publicly claiming that royal finances were tight due to economic pressures. But the most devastating revelation came when Marcus heard them discussing what they called population management initiatives. The king and his advisors were talking about deliberately withholding medical supplies from refugee camps that housed people who had been displaced by their mining operations. They calculated that reducing the population in these camps by 30 to 40% would make it easier to resettle the survivors in areas where they would be less likely to organize resistance against future operations. Marcus realized he was listening to a conversation about genocide. The people discussing these plans weren't military commanders or rogue government officials. They were the individuals his family had served loyally for 3 generations. The institution that had given his life meaning was being used as a front for mass murder and theft, on a scale that defied comprehension. The immediate challenge facing Marcus wasn't just emotional, it was practical. Palace guards were searched at the end of every shift to ensure they weren't removing any documents or recording devices. Their personal phones were stored in lockers outside the secure areas, and they were prohibited from taking notes about anything they observed during their duties. Even if Marcus wanted to report what he had learned, he had no way to prove that these conversations had actually taken place. Moreover, Marcus understood that his accusations would be his word against that of the king and his closest advisors. Who would believe that a junior palace guard had uncovered evidence of international war crimes? Who would take seriously claims that seemed to belong more in a conspiracy theory than in the real world of modern politics? As his shift ended that morning, Marcus walked home through the familiar streets of his neighborhood. But everything looked different now. The flags hanging from government buildings no longer represented the noble ideals he had been taught to respect. They had become symbols of deception and murder. The tourists taking pictures outside the palace gates had no idea that the institution they were celebrating was built on a foundation of systematic violence. When Marcus arrived home, he found his father preparing for his own shift at the palace. The older man noticed his son's distressed appearance and asked if everything was all right. For a moment, Marcus considered telling his father everything he had learned, but he realized that doing so would force his father to choose between his family's legacy and his conscience. It would mean asking his father to accept that their entire lives had been built on a lie. Instead, Marcus told his father he wasn't feeling well and went to his room. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to process what he had learned and determine what, if anything, he could do about it. He thought about the families in those refugee camps, about children who would die because medical supplies were being deliberately withheld, about community leaders who had been marked for death simply because they had tried to protect their people's land. Marcus realized that his training as a palace guard had prepared him for many different types of threats, but it had never addressed what to do when the people he was supposed to protect were the source of the greatest danger. The days following that fateful February night became a torturous exercise in maintaining normalcy while Marcus's world fell apart around him. Every morning he would put on his uniform, walk through the palace gates, and take his position, knowing that he was protecting people who were orchestrating mass murder. Every smile from his supervisors, every nod of approval from senior guards, every moment of pride his father expressed about the family's service felt like a betrayal of the innocent people dying because of royal greed. Marcus began paying attention to conversations he had previously filtered out as background noise. He discovered that the horrific meeting he had overheard wasn't an aberration. It was part of a regular pattern of criminal activity that had been going on for decades. The royal family held these planning sessions twice a month, usually scheduling them during times when most of the palace staff were focused on public events or official ceremonies. During his shifts, Marcus started noticing details that had previously seemed insignificant. He observed the comings and goings of men in expensive suits who didn't appear on any official visitor logs. He saw briefcases being exchanged in private corridors, witnessed phone calls where codes were used instead of names, and recognized the signs of an organization that had become expert at hiding its activities from public scrutiny. The psychological toll of this knowledge was devastating. Marcus found himself unable to eat regular meals, losing weight at an alarming rate and experiencing nightmares that left him exhausted each morning. He would dream about the faces of people he had never met, the villagers being murdered in African mining operations, the children dying in refugee camps, the community leaders being hunted down by mercenaries funded with royal money. But perhaps the most difficult aspect of his situation was the isolation. Marcus couldn't discuss what he had learned with anyone in his immediate circle. His father was too deeply invested in the family's tradition of royal service to handle the truth about their employers. His mother had spent her entire adult life proud of her husband's and son's prestigious positions. Learning that the royal family were criminals would destroy her sense of identity. Marcus's girlfriend Sarah was an elementary school teacher who often spoke admiringly about how the royal family supported education initiatives and charitable causes. She had grown up believing, like most citizens, that the monarchy represented the best values of their society. How could Marcus tell her that the scholarships and hospital donations that made headlines were funded by blood money stolen from some of the world's poorest communities? As weeks passed, Marcus began researching the situation using his limited free time and access to public information. He visited the local library during his days off, reading everything he could find about the mining operations and political situations in the countries where the royal family was active. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears and revealed that the scope of their criminal activities was even broader than he had initially realized. The mining operations weren't just displacing communities. They were destroying entire ecosystems and poisoning water supplies that millions of people depended on for survival. The royal family's business partners were using child labor in conditions that amounted to slavery, forcing children as young as 8 years old to work in dangerous mines for wages that barely covered one meal per day. Marcus found reports from international human rights organizations that documented systematic rape and torture in the areas where royal mining operations were active. Local women were being brutalized by security forces hired to protect the mines, and anyone who tried to report these crimes was either murdered or imprisoned on fabricated charges. The environmental damage was equally catastrophic. Entire river systems had been contaminated with mercury and other toxic chemicals used in the mining process. Agricultural land that had fed communities for generations was being stripped away and turned into open-pit mines that would remain environmental hazards for centuries to come. As Marcus absorbed this information, he realized that the conversations he had overheard in the palace represented just a tiny fraction of the suffering being caused by royal greed. For every murder or displacement he had heard discussed, there were hundreds of other crimes being committed by the network of corporations, mercenaries, and corrupt officials that the royal family controlled. The weight of this knowledge began affecting Marcus's performance as a guard. His supervisors noticed that he seemed distracted, that he was no longer maintaining the focused alertness that had made him such a valuable member of the security team. During one particularly difficult shift, Marcus found himself staring at the king during a public ceremony, wondering how someone could appear so dignified and caring while secretly orchestrating genocide. The king noticed Marcus's stare and approached him after the ceremony. "Is everything all right, guard?" the king asked with what appeared to be genuine concern. "You seem troubled." Marcus felt his heart racing as he looked into the eyes of a man he now knew to be a mass murderer. "I'm fine, Your Majesty," he managed to respond, "just focused on maintaining security." The king smiled and patted Marcus on the shoulder. "Your family has served the crown with distinction for generations," he said. "Your dedication doesn't go unnoticed." As the king walked away, Marcus realized that he was now living in two completely different realities simultaneously. In one reality, he was a respected guard serving a beloved monarch who represented his country's highest ideals. In the other reality, he was an accomplice to crimes against humanity, using his position to protect people who were systematically murdering innocent civilians for profit. This psychological strain began manifesting in physical symptoms that Marcus couldn't hide from the people around him. He developed chronic headaches that left him nauseated during long shifts. His hands would shake uncontrollably when he was nervous, and he found himself jumping at sounds that had never bothered him before. Sarah started asking questions about Marcus's health and mood changes. She suggested that he might be working too hard, that perhaps he should request some vacation time to rest and recover. Marcus wanted desperately to explain to her what was really causing his distress, but he knew that sharing this information would put her in danger and potentially implicate her as an accessory to his knowledge of royal crimes. The isolation became even more complete when Marcus realized that other guards must have overheard similar conversations during their own shifts. The fact that none of them had ever spoken up suggested either that they didn't understand the significance of what they were hearing, or that they had made a conscious decision to remain silent despite knowing about the royal family's criminal activities. Marcus began observing his colleagues more carefully, looking for signs that they shared his knowledge and his distress. He noticed that some of the senior guards seemed unusually tense during certain meetings, that they would position themselves in ways that made it difficult to overhear conversations, and that they had developed subtle signals for communicating with each other about sensitive situations. One evening, Marcus was approached by Thomas Mitchell, a guard who had served in the palace for over 15 years and was widely respected for his professionalism and loyalty. Thomas asked Marcus to join him for coffee after their shift, suggesting they meet at a small cafe several blocks away from the palace grounds. During their conversation, Thomas carefully probed Marcus's observations and reactions to recent events at the palace. Without directly stating what he knew, Thomas made it clear that he had been aware of the royal family's criminal activities for several years and had struggled with the same moral dilemmas that were now consuming Marcus. "The thing about this job," Thomas said carefully, "is that sometimes you learn things that challenge everything you thought you believed about the people you're protecting. The question becomes whether you're strong enough to carry that knowledge without letting it destroy you." Marcus realized that Thomas was offering him a choice. He could follow Thomas's example and find a way to compartmentalize his knowledge, to continue serving the royal family, while mentally separating himself from their crimes. Or he could allow his conscience to guide his actions, regardless of the personal consequences. Thomas explained that several guards had tried to report royal crimes to outside authorities over the years, but their accusations had been dismissed as fabrications by disgruntled employees. The royal family's influence extended far beyond the palace walls. They had allies in law enforcement, in the military, in the media, and in the international community who would work to discredit anyone who threatened the monarchy's reputation. "The system is designed to protect itself," Thomas told Marcus. "Individual guards like us don't have the power to change it. All we can do is try to maintain our sanity and protect our families while serving out our time." As Marcus walked home that night, he understood that Thomas had been trying to help him by offering a path toward emotional survival. But he also realized that accepting Thomas's approach would mean becoming complicit in genocide. It would mean choosing his own psychological comfort over the lives of innocent people who were being murdered with money that came from his country's treasury. Marcus spent the next several days wrestling with this decision. He could follow Thomas's advice and find a way to mentally separate himself from the consequences of royal actions. He could focus on his immediate duties, protect his family's reputation, and avoid the personal destruction that would inevitably result from challenging the monarchy. Or he could acknowledge that some truths are too important to keep secret, regardless of the personal cost. He could accept that his comfortable life as a palace guard was built on a foundation of mass murder, and that continuing to protect that foundation made him partly responsible for every future death that resulted from royal greed. The decision became clear to Marcus when he realized that he would never be able to look at himself in the mirror if he chose silence over justice. The nightmares, the physical symptoms, the psychological strain were not temporary problems that would resolve over time. They were his conscience, refusing to allow him to participate in genocide without consequence. Marcus understood that speaking out would probably cost him everything he had ever valued in his life. But he also understood that remaining silent would cost him something even more precious, his fundamental sense of human decency. Once Marcus decided that he could no longer remain silent about the royal family's crimes, he faced the enormous challenge of figuring out how to expose the truth in a way that would actually make a difference. His conversation with Thomas Mitchell had made it clear that simply reporting his knowledge to local authorities would be ineffective. The monarchy's influence was too extensive for traditional law enforcement channels to provide any meaningful response. Marcus spent weeks developing a plan that would maximize the impact of his revelations while minimizing the chances that his accusations could be dismissed or covered up. He understood that his credibility as a witness would be questioned from the moment he went public, so he needed to find ways to corroborate his testimony and provide evidence that couldn't be easily discredited. The first challenge was documenting the conversations he had overheard. Palace guards were prohibited from bringing any recording devices into secure areas, and attempting to smuggle such equipment past the sophisticated security screening would result in immediate termination and possible criminal charges. However, Marcus realized that his training as a guard had given him an excellent memory for details, and he began keeping detailed written records of everything he observed during his shifts. Each night after work, Marcus would sit in his room and write down every conversation fragment, every name mentioned, every date referenced, and every detail about the people involved in the royal family's criminal planning sessions. He recorded information about the timing of meetings, the locations where they took place, the security procedures that were followed, and the methods used to ensure privacy during sensitive discussions. Marcus also began researching the backgrounds of the various individuals he observed meeting with the royal family. Using public records and internet searches, he identified the business affiliations, political connections, and financial interests of the men who participated in these criminal planning sessions. This research revealed a network of corruption that extended far beyond what he had initially realized. Many of the royal family's business partners had been involved in similar operations in other countries, often working with different monarchies, dictatorships, and corrupt governments to exploit natural resources while systematically murdering local populations that opposed their activities. The pattern of behavior that Marcus had observed was not unique to his country's monarchy. It was part of an international criminal organization that operated with impunity because of the political protection provided by their royal and governmental connections. As Marcus compiled this information, he realized that traditional media outlets in his country would be reluctant to publish accusations against the royal family without overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing. The monarchy provided significant financial support to most major newspapers and television networks through advertising revenue and direct subsidies. Even media outlets that considered themselves independent relied heavily on access to royal events and exclusive interviews to maintain their audience appeal. However, Marcus discovered that international media organizations and human rights groups had been investigating similar operations in other countries for several years. These organizations had documented extensive evidence of the systematic murder and displacement of communities in areas where royal business partners were active, but they had been unable to establish direct connections between these crimes and the monarchies that were benefiting from them. Marcus realized that his testimony could provide the missing link that international investigators needed to prove royal involvement in genocide and crimes against humanity. His position as a palace guard gave him access to information that outside investigators could never obtain through traditional research methods. The challenge was finding a way to contact these international organizations without alerting palace security to his activities. Marcus's personal communications were routinely monitored as part of standard security procedures for palace employees. His internet usage, phone calls, and even his mail were subject to random inspection to ensure that he wasn't sharing sensitive information about royal activities or security procedures. Marcus solved this problem by using public internet access at the local library during his days off. He created anonymous email accounts and began reaching out to investigative journalists who specialized in exposing government corruption and human rights violations. He was careful not to reveal his identity or specific information about his position, but he provided enough detail about his knowledge to generate interest from several prominent international news organizations. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Marcus received dozens of replies from journalists, human rights investigators, and legal experts who wanted to learn more about his information. However, he quickly realized that he needed to be extremely selective about who he trusted with his testimony. Many of the people who contacted him wanted to meet immediately and seemed more interested in getting an exclusive story than in ensuring his safety or maximizing the impact of his revelations. Others asked questions that suggested they might be working for intelligence agencies or other organizations that could pose a threat to his security. After careful consideration, Marcus decided to work with Elena Rodriguez, an investigative journalist who had spent over a decade exposing government corruption in developing countries. Elena had a reputation for protecting her sources and for conducting thorough investigations that resulted in meaningful legal and political consequences for the criminals she exposed. Elena understood the sensitivity of Marcus's situation and was willing to work slowly and carefully to develop his testimony in a way that would provide maximum protection for his safety. She explained that his accusations against the royal family would inevitably result in attempts to discredit him personally, and that he needed to be prepared for extensive scrutiny of his background, his motives, and his mental stability. To address these concerns, Elena arranged for Marcus to undergo psychological evaluation by an independent expert who specialized in assessing the credibility of witnesses in high-profile criminal cases. The evaluation confirmed that Marcus was mentally stable, that his memory of events was reliable, and that his motivations were consistent with genuine moral outrage rather than personal grievance or financial opportunism. Elena also helped Marcus develop additional evidence to support his testimony. She taught him techniques for documenting conversations and observations that would provide corroboration for his accusations. Under her guidance, Marcus began taking more detailed notes about the timing and participants in royal meetings, and he started paying closer attention to documents and materials that might provide independent verification of the crimes he was witnessing. The most challenging aspect of this preparation process was maintaining his normal routine while secretly gathering evidence against his employers. Marcus had to continue performing his duties as a palace guard with the same level of professionalism that had earned him his prestigious position, while simultaneously documenting information that would destroy the institution he was supposed to be protecting. This psychological strain was compounded by Marcus's growing awareness of the immediate consequences his revelations would have for innocent people. Every day that he delayed going public was another day that community leaders were being murdered in African mining operations. Another day that children were dying in refugee camps where medical supplies were being deliberately withheld. Another day that families were being displaced from their ancestral lands to satisfy royal greed. Marcus began having conversations with Elena about the optimal timing for releasing his testimony. She explained that the impact of his revelations would be maximized if they were coordinated with the release of complementary investigations by other journalists and human rights organizations. Several international groups had been working independently to document royal involvement in similar crimes, and Elena was coordinating with these groups to ensure that Marcus's testimony would be part of a comprehensive exposé that would be impossible for the royal family to dismiss or cover up. The plan that emerged from these discussions was both elegant and devastating. Marcus's testimony would be published simultaneously by major newspapers in 12 different countries, accompanied by supporting evidence that had been gathered by international investigators over several years. The coordinated release would occur during a week when the royal family was scheduled to host an international summit on human rights and sustainable development, an event that was intended to enhance their reputation as progressive leaders, but would instead become the backdrop for their exposure as war criminals. Elena explained that this approach would make it impossible for the royal family to control the narrative about Marcus's accusations. Instead of being able to frame his revelations as the complaints of a disgruntled employee, they would be forced to respond to a comprehensive international investigation that documented systematic criminal behavior over multiple decades and across several continents. As the date for this coordinated release approached, Marcus found himself experiencing a strange mixture of terror and relief. He was terrified about the personal consequences he would face for betraying the institution that had defined his family's identity for 3 generations. But he was also relieved at the prospect of finally being able to speak publicly about the horrific crimes he had been forced to witness in silence. Marcus's final weeks as a palace guard were surreal. He continued to stand watch over meetings where genocide was planned and mass murder was discussed as casually as other people might talk about business investments or vacation plans. But now, instead of feeling helpless about his knowledge of these crimes, he felt empowered by his plan to expose them to the world. The most difficult moment came when Marcus realized that his revelations would inevitably destroy his father's career and his family's reputation. The Chen family's 3 generations of distinguished service to the crown would be remembered primarily as the background for Marcus's betrayal of royal trust. His father would face questions about whether he had knowledge of royal crimes and had chosen to remain silent, regardless of whether these accusations were true. Marcus considered trying to prepare his family for what was about to happen, but he realized that any advance warning would compromise their ability to claim plausible ignorance about his plans. The best protection he could provide for his parents was to ensure that they could honestly claim complete surprise about his decision to go public with his accusations. The night before Elena was scheduled to publish her investigation, Marcus worked his final shift as a palace guard. He stood watch outside the conference room where he had first overheard evidence of royal involvement in genocide, and he listened to the king and his advisors planning additional mining operations that would displace another 100,000 people from their homes. As Marcus listened to these plans, he realized that his decision to break the palace code wasn't just about exposing past crimes. It was about preventing future atrocities. Every mining operation that was cancelled because of international scrutiny, every mercenary group that was disbanded because of legal pressure, every corrupt official who was arrested because of his testimony would represent lives saved and communities protected. When his shift ended that morning, Marcus walked out of the palace gates for the last time as a loyal guard. Within hours, he would become the most famous whistleblower in modern history, and the institution he had spent his adult life protecting would begin the process of collapse that would ultimately reshape international politics and human rights law. The morning of April 15th began like any ordinary day for most of the world, but by evening, nothing would ever be the same again. Marcus Chen woke up in his childhood bedroom for what he knew would be the last time as an anonymous palace guard. In just a few hours, Elena Rodriguez's investigation would be published simultaneously across 12 countries, and Marcus's testimony would expose the royal family's involvement in genocide to over 2 billion readers. Elena had arranged for Marcus to spend the day at a safe house outside the city, surrounded by security personnel who specialized in protecting high-value witnesses from government retaliation. As Marcus prepared to leave his family's home, he looked around at the photographs and mementos that documented 3 generations of loyal service to the crown. By the end of the day, these symbols of family pride would represent a legacy of unwitting complicity and mass murder. The coordinated media release was timed to begin at 6 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, ensuring that the story would break during prime morning news hours across Europe and Africa, while reaching evening audiences in Asia and Australia. Elena had spent months coordinating with editors and publishers to ensure that the investigation couldn't be suppressed by legal challenges or political pressure from any single government. The first publication appeared in The Guardian with a front-page headline that read, "Royal Guard exposes palace genocide. Exclusive testimony reveals systematic murder of civilians." Within minutes, similar headlines appeared in Le Monde, Der Spiegel, The New York Times, and 8 other major international newspapers. Each publication had been provided with different aspects of Elena's investigation, ensuring that the complete story could only be understood by reading multiple sources. Marcus watched the initial coverage from the safe house, using secure internet connections to monitor the global response to his revelations. The immediate reaction was one of shock and disbelief. Many readers initially assumed that the story was fabricated, that no modern monarchy could be involved in such systematic criminal behavior without detection by international observers. However, the credibility of Marcus's testimony was quickly established by the supporting evidence that international investigators had been gathering for years. Satellite imagery showed the progression of mining operations in areas where local populations had been displaced. Financial records documented the flow of money from royal accounts to mercenary groups that had carried out mass killings. Communications intercepts revealed conversations between royal advisors and the leaders of corrupt governments that had facilitated these operations. The royal family's first response was predictably dismissive. A palace spokesperson issued a statement describing Marcus's accusations as the fabrications of a mentally disturbed former employee who has been dismissed from royal service for erratic behavior. The statement claimed that Marcus had been under psychological evaluation for several months, and that his accusations were part of an elaborate delusion brought on by work-related stress. But this response strategy collapsed within hours, as additional evidence began to emerge from sources that had nothing to do with Marcus's testimony. Other palace employees, emboldened by Marcus's example, began coming forward with their own observations of suspicious activities. International banking investigators revealed financial transactions that corroborated Marcus's descriptions of how royal accounts were being used to fund criminal operations. Most damaging of all, Elena's investigation had uncovered video recordings of several planning meetings that had been secretly made by palace security systems. These recordings provided indisputable proof that Marcus's descriptions of royal conversations were accurate in every detail. The world could now hear the king's voice as he casually discussed the murder of community leaders and the deliberate starvation of refugee populations. The international response was swift and devastating. The United Nations Security Council called an emergency session to address what the Secretary-General described as credible evidence of crimes against humanity committed by a sitting head of state. The International Criminal Court announced that it was opening an investigation into the royal family's activities and would be seeking arrest warrants for genocide and war crimes. Individual governments began taking action as well. The European Union imposed immediate sanctions on all royal business interests and froze assets belonging to the monarchy. The United States Congress passed emergency legislation prohibiting American companies from conducting business with any organization connected to the royal family. African governments that had been victims of royal mining operations demanded immediate compensation for damages and the extradition of royal family members to face trial for mass murder. The domestic response was equally dramatic. Citizens who had spent their entire lives believing in the monarchy as a symbol of their nation's highest values found themselves forced to confront evidence that their beloved royal family were international war criminals. Spontaneous demonstrations erupted in major cities as people demanded the immediate abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of democratic institutions. Marcus watched these developments with a mixture of satisfaction and terror. He was gratified to see that his decision to speak out was generating the kind of international response that could actually prevent future atrocities. But he was also terrified about the personal consequences he would face as the person who had triggered this global crisis. The royal family's security apparatus quickly focused their attention on locating and silencing Marcus. Intelligence sources within the safe house warned Elena that royal operatives were conducting a systematic search for Marcus, using resources that included both official security services and private mercenary groups that had previously been employed in African mining operations. Elena made the decision to move Marcus to a second safe house in a neighboring country, but this relocation was complicated by the fact that Marcus's identity was now known to millions of people around the world. His photograph had been published alongside his testimony, making it impossible for him to move through airports or cross borders without being recognized by both supporters and opponents. The solution came from an unexpected source. Several African governments that had been victims of royal mining operations offered to provide Marcus with political asylum and protection from royal retaliation. These governments understood that Marcus's testimony was their best hope for achieving justice for the genocide that had been committed against their citizens. Marcus accepted asylum from the government of Ghana, which had been one of the primary targets of royal mining operations. The Ghanaian president personally guaranteed Marcus's safety and announced that his country would provide whatever protection was necessary to ensure that Marcus could continue testifying against the royal family in international legal proceedings. The journey to Ghana required extensive security precautions that resembled a military operation more than a simple international flight. Marcus was transported in an armored convoy to a military airfield, where he boarded a cargo plane that had been modified to provide passenger accommodations. The flight path was kept secret until after the plane had landed safely in Accra. Meanwhile, the situation in Marcus's home country was rapidly deteriorating into political chaos. The revelations about royal crimes had shattered the legitimacy of the entire governmental system, which was constitutionally based on the principle that the monarchy represented the moral foundation of the nation. If the royal family were war criminals, then every law they had signed, every policy they had endorsed, and every governmental action taken in their name was morally compromised. Mass demonstrations calling for the abolition of the monarchy grew larger and more militant each day. Police and military units found themselves divided between those who remained loyal to the crown and those who believed that the royal family should be arrested and tried for their crimes. Several senior military officers resigned their commissions rather than continue serving a government that was headed by accused war criminals. The economic consequences were equally severe. International investors began withdrawing capital from the country as they realized that the political stability they had relied upon was built on a foundation of systematic criminal behavior. The national currency lost over 40% of its value in the first week following Marcus's revelations, and major corporations began relocating their operations to avoid being associated with a government led by accused genocidaires. Foreign governments that had maintained diplomatic relationships with the monarchy found themselves forced to choose between continuing these relationships and maintaining their credibility as supporters of human rights and international law. Most chose to distance themselves from the royal family, resulting in the country's increasing isolation from the international community. The royal family themselves became prisoners in their own palace as angry crowds surrounded the building demanding justice for the victims of royal crimes. The king made several television appearances attempting to deny Marcus's accusations, but these denials became increasingly implausible as additional evidence continued to emerge from international investigations. The turning point came when Ghana's government released audio recordings of phone conversations between the king and Ghanaian officials that had been secretly made during negotiations about mining operations. These recordings provided additional confirmation that Marcus's testimony was accurate and revealed that the royal family's criminal activities extended even beyond what he had initially described. As Marcus settled into his new life in Ghana, He received regular updates about the continuing collapse of the monarchy he had served for years. The international arrest warrants that had been issued for the royal family meant that they could no longer travel outside their own country without risking extradition to face trial for genocide and crimes against humanity. More importantly, the revelation of royal crimes was inspiring similar investigations into other monarchies and authoritarian governments around the world. Marcus's decision to break the palace code had demonstrated that even the most protected institutions could be exposed if individuals were willing to sacrifice their personal security for the sake of truth and justice. The ripple effects of Marcus's testimony were extending far beyond his original goal of exposing royal crimes. His example was encouraging other whistleblowers to come forward with evidence of government corruption, corporate malfeasance, and human rights violations that had previously been protected by institutional secrecy and political intimidation. International human rights organizations began referring to Marcus's actions as the beginning of a new era in accountability for government crimes. His testimony had proved that modern technology and international cooperation could make it impossible for even the most powerful institutions to hide systematic criminal behavior from public scrutiny. As the initial shock of the revelations began to settle into long-term political and legal consequences, Marcus realized that his decision to speak out had accomplished something far more significant than simply exposing royal crimes. He had demonstrated that individual conscience, supported by international cooperation and technological capability, could challenge institutional power in ways that had never been possible before. The world was indeed never the same again. But the changes that Marcus had triggered were only just beginning to reshape international politics and human rights law.